The road to Dunhill. Fog rolled in thick as cotton over Route 17. The headlights of Oliver's old truck cut through it in thin beams, barely illuminating the dark, desolate stretch of road ahead. He had a map folded on the passenger seat, the ink smeared from a spilled coffee earlier. Oliver had lived in the region all his life, but he'd never heard of Dunhill before tonight. Dunhill wasn't on any map he knew of, yet it was the only place nearby with a mechanic, or so the stranger at the last gas station said. The truck was acting up, sputtering and stalling out every few miles, and he knew he wouldn't make it home without help. So he took the turn as directed, the asphalt giving way to a winding gravel path. As he drove deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, looming on either side of the road like dark sentinels. Shadows danced in his peripheral vision, and every now and then, he caught a glimpse of movement among the trees. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. He rolled his window up anyway, feeling an odd chill settle over him despite the stuffy heat inside the cab. The road twisted and turned, narrowing until he had to slow down to a crawl. He glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. The fog seemed to thicken, dampening any sound, and his truck's sputtering seemed muffled, swallowed up by the silence. Oliver's grip tightened on the wheel. Just as he was beginning to wonder if he'd made a mistake, the trees parted, and he saw the faint outline of a sign. Welcome to Dunhill, Est, 1899. The place looked abandoned. Ramshackle buildings lined the empty streets, their windows dark and shattered. The only light came from a single street lamp flickering weakly on the corner. Oliver pulled up beside it and killed the engine, sitting in silence for a moment, listening to the soft ticking of the cooling engine. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the hairs on his neck prickling. Taking a deep breath, he got out and looked around. His footsteps echoed as he walked, the sound too loud in the quiet. No houses showed any signs of life. A few cars, rusted and missing tires, were parked at odd angles along the street. As he approached what looked like a general store, he saw a figure standing in the shadows near the entrance. Oliver paused, feeling a jolt of both relief and unease. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing a tall, thin man with skin that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. He wore an old-fashioned suit, complete with a frayed vest, and his eyes seemed to shine with an unnatural gleam. "You lost, friend?" the man asked in a slow drawl. Oliver cleared his throat, trying to hide his discomfort. "Yeah, my truck's giving me trouble. I was told there's a mechanic here?" The man's mouth stretched into a wide grin, revealing rows of yellowed teeth. "Oh, we've got what you need here in Dunhill. Come on, follow me." Without waiting for a reply, the man turned and walked down the street, his steps eerily silent. Oliver hesitated, glancing back at his truck, but he knew he didn't have many options. With a sigh, he followed. They walked through the ghostly town, past houses with boarded-up windows and doors hanging off their hinges. The man led him to a low building at the end of the street, a sign barely visible above the door. Dunhill Auto Repair. Is there someone here who can fix my truck?" Oliver asked. The man smiled again, a glint in his eye. "Don't you worry. The mechanic will see you real soon." Inside, the air smelled of oil and rust, thick and suffocating. A single light bulb flickered overhead, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. Tools lay scattered across workbenches, and in the corner, a hulking figure hunched over an old engine, muttering to himself. "Jim," the man said, his voice soft and oily, "we got a visitor." Jim straightened, turning slowly to face Oliver. He was huge, his face obscured by a thick beard, eyes dark and hollow. When he grinned, it looked more like a snarl. He didn't say a word, just nodded at Oliver with a slow, deliberate motion. "You're Jim? The mechanic?" Oliver asked, his voice trembling slightly. He felt the walls closing in around him, the air too thick, too heavy. "Sure am," Jim replied, his voice a low rumble. "Let's have a look at your truck." They stepped back outside, and Jim lumbered over to the truck, peering under the hood. Oliver stood to the side, trying to stay calm, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The shadows seemed to shift around him, and he felt eyes watching him from every window, every dark alley. After a moment, Jim straightened and wiped his hands on a greasy rag. "Looks like you got a busted alternator. Gonna take a while to fix. You got somewhere to stay?" Oliver blinked. He hadn't thought that far ahead. assuming he'd just get the truck fixed and be on his way. No, I just need to get home. The man from before stepped forward, his smile never wavering. We've got a place you can stay for the night. Won't cost you a thing. Oliver hesitated. Everything in him screamed to leave, to get back on the road, but his truck was dead, and he knew he had no choice. All right, he said reluctantly. Thanks. The man led him down a narrow alley to a small boarding house with peeling paint and sagging shutters. Inside, the walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the air smelled of mildew. A single room waited at the end of the hall, the bed covered in a thin, yellowed sheet. Sleep well, the man said, his voice dripping with something Oliver couldn't place. He closed the door, leaving Oliver alone. He lay on the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, every creak and groan of the old building setting his nerves on edge. He finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a whisper. He sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. At first, there was only silence. Then he heard it again, a soft, raspy voice calling his name. Oliver. His blood ran cold. The voice was coming from outside the window. He climbed out of bed and approached, you peering through the cracked glass. In the foggy street below, he saw them, figures standing motionless, their faces turned up toward his window. There must have been a dozen of them, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes empty black pits. Then, in unison, they all smiled, their mouths stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharpened teeth. Oliver stumbled back, his heart racing, the hairs on his arms standing up. He grabbed his bag, threw on his jacket, and rushed out the door, ignoring the distant laughter echoing down the hall. He had to get out of this town, even if he had to walk. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the buildings. He ran back to the mechanic's shop, but his truck was gone, vanished without a trace. A hand clamped down on his shoulder, and he whirled around, staring into the face of Jim, his grin wider and more sinister than ever. Behind him, the man in the suit appeared, flanked by the silent townsfolk, their eyes still empty, still watching. Leaving so soon? The man asked, his voice smooth as silk. But you haven't even had a chance to meet the rest of Dunhill. Oliver's scream was swallowed by the fog as they closed in, their hands cold and clammy, their mouths stretched into those horrific, toothy smiles. And as the darkness took him, he realized he'd never leave Dunhill. He'd become just another shadow in the fog, another pair of eyes, watching the next unlucky traveler who wandered too